in 2015, there was the African Union peacekeeping forces that were pulled into Darfur, which kind of helped put a little bit of a plateau to the war. Like, we didn't see an escalation of the war at that time. The African Union peacekeeping forces really kind of protected the civilians, they but with Abdullah Hamdok, he wasn't able to financially keep them there.
It's crazy that in the African countries, only like something crazy like 50% of them get protections.
Mm-hmm.
Yet if they do make it to Europe, 99% would get protections, simply because of what's going on. And yet, depending on which country you go to in Europe, you may not even get a chance to claim your asylum because you'll automatically be detained.
It was very sad to see the way that a lot of the Sudanese that were escaping into South Sudan were being left in. I know, like, some of the Sudanese I spoke to were considering going back to Sudan because of how bad the situation was in South Sudan.
Everybody, welcome back to Fractured for a very special episode for World Refugee Week. In recent episodes and in ones that will follow, we have been spending a significant amount of time reporting about different issues that are affecting specific areas of Africa. Kakuma camp in northern Kenya, the Wagner Group, also known as the Africa Corps, focusing on their engagement in West Africa and the Sahel. But today, especially because it is World Refugee Week, we really needed to talk about Sudan. And to do that, we could not think of anyone better than one of our colleagues and friends, a journalist who has been deeply engaged in reporting on Sudan for the past 6 years. Jordan Siegel has been on our program in the past. And if you want to go a little deeper into what the situation in Sudan looked like back in 2024, you can check out our season 3, episode 19, Sudan's Invisible War, which profiled a film that Jordan has been working on. So he's a filmmaker, journalist, an amazing person, and I'm just fantastic person to unpack this with. So Jordan, thank you so much for being with us again. Shockingly, it's almost exactly 2 years to the day since we recorded with you last. Wow. And I really wish that we would be talking about a different topic, but unfortunately the situation in Sudan is getting worse by the day. So for our audience members and our listeners and viewers, we really want to help them understand where we are today and then help them tether back to how did we get here. So help us understand this unbelievably devastating humanitarian crisis.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me back. It's always a pleasure to be with you guys and to be on your podcast. So thank you. Yeah, the situation in Sudan has unfortunately gotten worse. We thought, in the beginning of the war, especially when we last spoke, that there would be some way that the two parties, these two armed parties, would come together at the table and negotiate or agree on some sort of peace treaty that would somehow um, reverse the crisis or put a halt to it, constrain it. But now we're seeing this war really get more entrenched, and it's actually hardening itself to what we will see in the future of Sudan. The things that we're seeing now are extremely heartbreaking because even within the recent months, within the past year, beginning of this year, we have seen the war take a drastic turn for the worse. Something that we were hoping it wouldn't do, but it just continues to escalate to new measures. Right now, we're seeing both parties, the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces, take control in different spheres throughout Sudan. So they have major controls over different portions of Sudan. And what they're doing on the ground to the civilians is what's extremely heartbreaking, breaks every single sector of international laws. So it's heartbreaking to continue to report on it, but it's also very important. So thank you for covering this. But yeah, it's unfortunately there is no there's no really hope that we can really be discussing with this war. It's a tragedy. Yeah.
2 years ago, when we started talking about this, it was already a humanitarian crisis. It was already chaotic and very, very, very easily connected to the history of what had been happening, especially in the western part of the country in Darfur. The only time any country had ever labeled what was happening as a genocide in 2004, the United States did. The At that time when we reported, the numbers were staggering. It was 8 million people displaced, 2 million refugees in the region, like 15,000 people dying in specific instances. And now, 2 years later, we're talking about 14, 15 million people displaced, 4 million refugees in the majority in the region, in areas that we're already reporting on are not safe enough for the local residents, much less like the idea of refugees in South Sudan right now from Sudan sounds insane, considering they are also in armed conflict and they have their own refugees. They're the number 3 sending country of refugees. So imagine what it would be like to be seeking refuge in a country where they are also in the top 5 of countries seeking refuge. I don't understand how we've gotten here so without any real engagement, it seems, from international forces to halt this in some way. Could you help us understand a little bit of what really is the division at the current time? Most people may have heard of Darfur because of child soldiers, or they could have heard it about like Sudan's lost boys, or they've seen it in some films, in narrative films, or they've heard of Bashir. Like they've heard of some things from the past, but they may not know really what's happened over the course of the last 5 or 6 years in the country.
Well, the situation in Sudan is very complex. With there's a long history to where we are right now. But to kind of go back where al Bashir was in power, and a lot of people have heard of the Darfur genocide with the Janjaweeds, who did a massive genocide amongst the Darfurians that ended up killing 500,000 people. And so what ended up happening, the Janjaweeds were working with under al Bashir, and al Bashir's mission was to turn Sudan into an Islamic state. That was his whole goal. But once he started being charged by the ICC for war crimes, he decided to take the Janjaweeds, which was led by Hemeti, and turn them into the Rapid Support Forces. And the Rapid Support, and this was kind of to dodge some of the war crimes and war crimes that they were being committed by the ICC, and it worked. The Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, became a paramilitary group, but they were just the same Janjaweeds, but wearing different uniforms. And they were still committing these acts of terror amongst the Darfurians across Sudan. And what ended up happening was that Hemeti, who controlled the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, he had his own banking system. He was very enriched himself because he used a lot of the gold. He was in charge of the gold, not just the military, but also the gold. And he also had the Sudanese army, which was led by Al Burhan. And the Sudanese army was led by Islamic Brotherhood, which also wanted to turn Sudan into an Islamic state. So right when al-Bashir was kind of losing his power, being charged for war crimes, they knew that his leadership was kind of coming towards an end. So with the civilians who kept protesting to oust al-Bashir out of power, his 2 military commanders, Al Burhan, who controlled the Sudanese Armed Forces, and Hemeti, who controlled the Rapid Support Forces, came and said, "We're siding with civilians." Therefore, he had no support, and he had to step out of power. Then you had Abdullah Hamdok, who led the civilian council, and it was the first time that Sudan really saw democracy on the horizon. But Abdullah Hamdok didn't have a strong economic background, and Sudan was in a lot of debt because of the previous war. And he was asking international donors from the US to help him with this international debt, or this debt that he was having a hard time getting out of. And in 2015, there was the African Union peacekeeping forces that were pulled into Darfur, which kind of helped put a little bit of a plateau to the war. Like, we didn't see an escalation of the war at that time. The African Union peacekeeping forces really kind of protected the civilians, and but with Abdullah Hamdok, he wasn't able to financially keep them there. So he had to change them to the African Union peacekeeping mission using UN Chapter 6. And when he did that, it just completely fell through. So then there is no security in Darfur, and the RSFs then moved in. And then it was the worst violence they had ever seen. And this started to happen and increase around 2019 and 2020. When that happened, Abdullah Hamdok was basically not really having a strong position in the government, and then there was a coup, and Hemeti and Al Burhan then took control and turned the government into a military government. And when I was there in 2020, you could see this kind of split between the two militaries, the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces, kind of taking control of different areas throughout Darfur. And then eventually they started to battle each other in order to have control over Sudan. So that's what we're seeing now.
This seems like a bit of a trend in the country, in that, like, even if you go back to its original founding in the 50s, when the British and the Egyptians finally leave, when the Anglo-Egyptian influence leaves, you already had a bit of a civil war at that time, fighting against their presence to get to a place where they could have democratic. It's part of the democratic wave in Africa at the time, and all these different countries. But then immediately it turns into a military dictatorship. And then you have it happening again where, Bashir is able to solidify. You've had multiple coups over the course of time. And then here in 2019, it's really the economics of the splitting of Sudan into Sudan and South Sudan that, like, really crippled Bashir's ability to maintain control. Lost all the oil, 75% of the oil. Suddenly his economic capacity to keep his cronies happy disappeared, and then he really eventually loses. It's really about the economic impact, and then the people politically were able to rise up against him. But then here you have, once again, undermined by a military coup, destroys the chance for this country to actually have a democratic foundation. And
right.
And now you have, I guess, yes, it's a better branding to switch from the Arabic translation loosely of devils on horseback to rapid support forces. That sounds a little bit better, right? But they're not better.
There's the same people with just wearing different uniforms.
Literally the same people. Hemeti is the same person who was in charge of the previous group. So, but now you had, so you have this coup, and you have a military leadership, and the people are losing their chance for democracy, but they're still not what's going on right now. That's yet to happen.
It's interesting that you brought up the 1950s, because something that's really important that really defines these two military forces is that the Rapid Support Forces are made up of tribalism groups, and the Sudanese Armed Forces are made up of Arab Muslims. So back in the 1950s, when they were gaining their independence, that was a split. The British were controlling the Darfur region, and Egyptians were controlling the south within Khartoum, and that area of Sudan. So, and they were made up of Arab Muslims. So there is a division between these two tribes that were always going into war with one another. So they're still ethnically different from one another, and that's why they're at war with each other. So that's a really good point to bring up as well. Yeah.
And then that's also why Bashir was able to kind of consolidate power, in that he started to Islamify the region, the country. He's trying to push that in, and then weaponize this Janjaweed to go ethnically cleanse the region. I mean, this was the Masalit people were devastated by all of this, and it continues to today.
So when I was there, you had the military coup had already happened. Abdullah Hamdok was already ousted out of power. So when I arrived, it was very obvious that the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces were taking different sections to control throughout Darfur. But they would come together in areas throughout Khartoum and Kordofan, but they had different neighborhoods that they were had their military based. So it was already before the war happened. It was evident that they weren't collaborating with one another. They didn't have, the same military zone. They weren't working together. They weren't sharing the same vehicles. They were always separate from one another. These two forces were we're never really going to collaborate with one another because they come from different backgrounds, different identities. You had the Rapid Support Forces, who were the Janjaweeds, who make up tribal groups that are coming from Libya, and then you had the Sudanese Armed Forces, which is basically a Muslim Brotherhood army. So they had very different backgrounds, identities, religious backgrounds mostly. So it's very hard for the two to come together because they wanted different outcomes for what they wanted for Sudan. And Hamilton controlled a lot of the gold, and he's not willing to share his wealth in that. They had different, banking accounts that really kind of sanctioned them off, and that really kind of also made them not aligning with one another as well. So from the very beginning, they had different roles in the military, even under al-Bashir. They had different positions, different roles, and they never had a history of working together to begin with. And so now it's just kind of who is taking control over Sudan. They had their own proxies, they had their own way of working separately for so many years. So them coming together as one military government not only is taking away from their ego, but also taking away their control over different portions of Sudan. So you had the Rapid Support Forces, who really controlled a lot of the areas around Darfur. And then you also had the Sudanese army, who really controlled a lot of the areas within Khartoum and Kordofan in that area, and also the port of Sudan, which is, a huge, huge position to have, because that's kind of they're exporting and importing a lot of material through the port of Sudan. Um, and to have that kind of control is something that both sides really want. So there was no really way of them collaborating with one another. And now we're seeing them really taking control of different regions, different sections of Sudan.
Since we had you on the show last, you started to do a lot of specific work with, I would consider it more of a consortium than one entity, but the Sudan Human Rights Hub works and collaborates with like 40 different organizations through the region, trying to document and verify reports of human rights violations, and tried to create a central case for crimes against the people of Sudan. And this work that you're doing, this organization, is pretty unbelievable in what they're doing. And so really, really impressed with the way that you're considering the fact that when we talked to you 2 years ago, like, it was really hard to find anybody who had been on the ground, who had been doing things inside the country, we were like shocked that, you had been in, and you told us these amazing stories of what it was like for you to be inside the country and work. But the way that the information is out, the way that you are able to get this information, and then what does the Human Rights Hub, how do they do it?
Yeah, it's very difficult now, because there are no journalists in Sudan, absolutely none, and there's also no satellites that allow us to communicate inside Sudan, which is one of the very devastating things. Is that it's very hard to report with what's happening in Sudan because you can't talk to the civilians can't talk to you. You have really you. reports take a long time just because of that, because you have to go through other resources in order to verify certain information that you want to gather that's happening currently in Sudan. So yeah, we have like a very amazing team. We have an archive team that collects all the archives that are gathered on the internet, and we put them in different folders. So like if we want to do a report on the famine crisis, we'll have different people that are in charge of collecting archives that we find on Telegram to X, and putting them in folders, and us evaluating these videos that are taken either by the RSFs or by the Sudanese Armed Forces or by the civilians themselves. So we verify the videos that are being collected, and then we have different resources on the ground to collect testimonies and interviews. And that takes a long time. That takes about probably 2, sometimes 3 weeks for us to gain back our interviews or our testimonies that we need for our reports. So it takes a while for us to finish any kind of investigation. We also use satellite imageries to verify certain airstrikes or certain sieges that are happening, showing like the difference between what happened a week ago to the devastations, especially if it's an arson attack to drone strike, seeing the comparison of before and after, and understanding how much damage it has caused throughout certain areas of Sudan.
The projects that I saw you working on that were most impressive to me was the oral history project, where you are conducting hundreds of interviews with people. Then you had this protest monitor that in 2021 you were able to like document all of the different protests around the country that were happening as a result of the military coup, and then what was happening, what the way that the military was reacting to those protests. It was very, very interesting to like investigate that map. And then the last one, the Shahid, the Sudan Shahid, which is like just Arabic for witness. And this was about the human rights violations that are happening. And that was just like, I got lost on this map. It was shocking when I first opened it up. And it was just like, oh my God, like the whole entire country is just a bunch of red dots, of giant red circles of all of these instances of violations. And it's just unbelievable how much visual documentation there actually is, as you're saying, by the people who are perpetrating the violence. It's a weird time now where people who are actually guilty of the crimes are documenting themselves being guilty of the crimes. Almost like they're proud of it.
Right?
It's fucked up. Like,
and posting it.
Yeah, and then they
knowing
post
that
it.
there
It's
won't
like,
get any kind of repercussions or any sort of
this sense of impunity. Like, there's nothing coming for us. There's no reason for me to fear posting this. This is like shocking. But those three in particular were past the investigations, which we could talk about. A couple of them were really, I mean, I just spent like a day diving into this map and I got lost in there. It was just unbelievable. Just the fact that it exists, that it is open source, that people can go to it. We'll put a link to it in the show notes so people can investigate it themselves. But it's really impressive work.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a very amazing team that I enjoy working with, and everybody has contributed in such major ways. And I think that we just all work together. Um, and just it's been such an honor to work with this organization. And yeah, so thank you for that.
In some of these investigations, the reality is really, really tragic, like what is currently happening. The way that civilians are being used as collateral to force the people are being abducted and just being held and starved out if they're not automatically killed or tortured, but they're being used as this kind of like commodity pit, like almost like they're trading them to some degree and saying like, well, hold this group until you surrender this territory. So the civilians are really just completely stuck. And then the other one was about the fact that it doesn't matter who owns the territory anymore. It's who owns the sky. And
Yes.
and could we talk a little bit about the modern warfare and how that's impacting the situation? And then maybe that would be an easy segue into how does that shit get into the country in the first place?
Yes, it's all very lighthearted
Yeah,
topics.
yeah, sure. Yeah. We're the feel good
But
podcast of
yeah,
the
no,
year for
it's
sure. We're going to win that award, right?
but yeah, no, that report, that investigation was the hardest investigation I have ever done. I think our team has really ever done. It took us a long time to complete that report just because we needed to take breaks mentally, and to really kind of make sure that we were okay, because it was such a tragic to see the way that the rapid support forces and the Sudanese armed forces as well,
Yeah, they're both
um
accused.
both sides were taking in civilians. Uh, A lot of the rapid support forces would take in civilians as ransom, so they would call their families if their families were in Egypt or in Chad. They would call their family and say, "Hey, we have your brother, your sister, your mother, your father, your uncle, your cousins, your friend, and you have to pay us this amount of money, or else we're going to kill them." So this was a huge tactic that they used on the civilians in mostly within Darfur. They had detention camps where they would detain them and they would shackle them and force them to famine. Um, a lot of it was to put fear into the civilians, into the locals, showing them that they are the superior ones, that they are the ones that are in control. They would tie them up and they would humiliate them and make them say phrases that would support the RSFs, belittle them. So all of these tactics were just to put fear into the community. Um, and they would videotape it. And like you said, they would post it, knowing that they would not get into any sort of trouble. And it was horrific because these were coming in by the dozens. We were just seeing so many of these just coming in. And even now that we had to kind of pick, okay, which ones do we really want to, to show and give a prime example of what's happening. These detention centers are happening all over across Sudan. And with SOF, with the Sudanese Armed Forces, they'll take civilians and they'll accuse them of being a part of the rapid support forces. And it's not even with these two military factors. There's different sections or different splinters of rebel groups, the SPLMs, that also taken people thinking and are accusing them for being part of one side or the other. Um, and it's just a way to pronounce, or a way to show superiority and to make sure that civilians know that these are the people who are in control. These detention centers are There's a lot more detention centers that we're seeing now in Kordofan and also in Khartoum. Um, but and they what they do is they take over hospitals, or they'll take over schools, and they'll turn those schools or hospitals into detention camps. Um,
How is
so that
this, like in this report there was this the Human Rights Commissioner Volker Turk saying expressing alarm. I read these lines and it's just like, are you what? He expressed alarm over the fact that these may be war crimes. Like, how is this not already elevated to the point where we are in the same place where we were 20 years ago, where people are aggressively calling this everything all the way up to genocide? How can the world not act on this from an international standpoint? This is really not something that they're debating openly about
oh,
solving. I'm just shocked when you read these things in these reports of these statements. Like, what would it
well, I
take? What do
mean,
you think
look,
it would take for them to get past expressing alarm? Like,
well, it's interesting because look how long it took them to put Al Bashir into prison for war crimes. How long was that trial for
yeah,
them to charge him with these immense amount of war crimes? I shouldn't have taken that long. Also, the deals and negotiations that foreign affairs were making with Sudan, with with Al Burhan and Hemeti, all these backroom deals. I think the thing is that Sudan has become, first of all, it's not in the interest of people to focus on. Geopolitically, it's not the focal point. It's not something that people are interested in. And I think that we have reached a point where there's so many different countries that are supporting this war. It's completely hard to dismantle. I think that people are too um are not have not enough knowledge to know how to dismantle this war, or how to step in, or how to charge certain perpetrators that are causing this war, because it's completely impossible to pinpoint, okay, this is one perpetrator, he was the leader of this, rapid support forces that did these certain international crimes. How do we sanction him off and put war crimes and charges on him and throw him to jail?
So
It's
you,
almost impossible right now to do that.
one of the other investigations that was like right at the top of the pile about this hospital in South Kordofan that was bombed, El Kouk, I think, and uh, people who live in that neighborhood were saying that prior to this essential civil war, it was, or even just a year or two ago, it was at the earliest stages of it, you had something like 3 to 4 people being buried a day. And now the number was something like pushing 10 a day. It's just
Hmm.
like, so it's very visible. And I think we had talked off, previously about how you can see this from above. You can see this from
Hmm.
the expansion of cemeteries, and where people are actually being put into the earth. But this is all from drones. This is all from air
Right.
fire. So it seems like everyone is fine and content to clarify that this is just the problem of these two generals fighting for power. This is a classic civil war inside a country, and as somehow no one in the world can do anything about it because it's just an internal matter. But it's very clear
Hmm.
that it's not an internal matter, because the last I
Right.
checked, no one's producing drones inside Sudan. So where are they coming
Yeah.
from? And what are the foreign actors that are influencing this? It feels like more of a classic proxy war than it feels like a civil war.
Right. Yeah. Kordofan has become a huge, major battleground currently, because it's such a huge supply route and territorial control. So both sides are trying to take over Kordofan at this moment. And with the drones that are increasing, especially since the beginning of this year, we are seeing more and more drone strikes than ever before, and they continue to increase. A lot of the drones that we're seeing now are circling around major facilities, from hospitals to IDP camps to markets, especially markets, because if you destroy the markets and you destroy the food and the access to stability, then that military can really then take control over that area. So sometimes there's not even military fighters or from opposite forces on that in that facility within that area, but they'll still strike, um, whether it's a hospital, school, market, just to make it their own military zone. And we're seeing each drone strike will kill, you know, with the Al Quq hospital that you just mentioned in Kurdifan, that killed 22 people just in one strike. And these drones are really advancing. They're having, surveillances on the that are being able to locate exactly where they want to strike. So it's going against huge international laws, and breaking extremely huge violations that are showing that they're deliberately targeting civilians, and both sides are. And what then ends up happening is that then they'll take over those areas, and then the fighting continues. But as the drones are continuing to advance, we're seeing more of these attacks increase, and more civilian casualties continue to rise, almost each month. It's extremely devastating to witness. So a lot of the people that we have spoken to on the ground, these testimonies, they they talk about the way that the drones work. They'll see the drones in the sky, and they'll be circling around, and some of them have time then to escape. But some of the civilians also describe the fact that they don't see the drones. Sometimes they are not aware of the drones coming, and then they'll just strike um, randomly, and that's when we see a lot of the bigger numbers of casualties that end up being buried in these kind of burial grounds that we're seeing also from satellite imageries. So yeah, it's very heartbreaking to see what's happening in Kordofan at the moment. Yeah.
Inside these types of like war crimes investigations, all of these things would obviously pass the test of being considered crimes against humanity, war
Hmm.
crimes, even pushing up if they reached up to higher levels of explicit agendas, potentially genocide in terms of the way it would be legally determined. But we're seeing this happening in lots of theaters around the world,
Hmm.
in Gaza, in Lebanon, and like Israel is doing this in many places, and now you have
Hmm.
indiscriminate drone bombing campaigns from Russia into Ukraine, and now Ukraine's using drones inside Moscow. Like
Yeah.
this is a new, but I feel like if that gets a free pass for a year in one conflict zone theater, then it automatically opens up the door to be like, oh, well, we could do that too. So no one's going to
Right.
stop them, then no one's going to stop us. And then if, while I really haven't really fully wrapped my head around the idea of why the UAE or Iran or these other places would want such instability in such a fertile region with so many natural resources, I feel like you would want it to be calm to benefit from what it has to offer. I don't I don't see any pressure against anyone other than RSF and SAF. And
Right.
that feels messed up. So Nasreen Malik recently writes for The Guardian, wrote a piece, and then many people have responded to it saying, why is there no fight after UAE? Why is there no aggression towards UAE for what they are funding? And then again, as you're saying, UAE is basically saying that it's all just assumed that they are involved.
Yeah.
But
Propaganda. It's like,
yeah, so they're
yeah.
able to try to like shuck it off and say that no, we're not doing that. But
Right.
all of these investigations are kind of proving the pathways and how the stuff is getting in, and it's quite obviously getting in. So
Right.
um, yeah, but like maybe if we could even like just maybe help me understand why anyone on the outside would want there to be such instability in Sudan. It doesn't make sense to me. Like even inside the country itself, if they were to really split this thing and you would have everyone in the east, which right now is under SAF control, and the Blue Nile region in the southwest corner by, this is an agricultural like heartland, but this is where all the Arabic gum is made. This is where all the food makes. This is where the hydroelectric water sources
Hmm.
come. This is how Egypt has water. This is insane. Like
Yes.
for that area to be under any type of conflict. And on the other side of the country, you have all this cattle, but they can't actually have any of that cattle survive if it's not for the feed that's coming from the east. So these two sides would, even if some sort of solution would happen here, they'd still have to interact with each other, much like they do with South Sudan, in that all the oil's in the south, but all the pipelines are in the north. So,
Right.
why is this advantageous for anybody for this to be this chaotic?
I think, well, it's really hard to say exactly and say this is the reason, this is, this is the why it's nobody's wanting to create some sort of stability because, like you said, there's so many resources, so many minerals that people could, you, you, you would think that people wouldn't want to destroy Sudan. Um, but both factories of the army of the military had made deals and negotiations with different proxies. So you have the rapid support forces making deals with China, with the UAE, while you had and also with South Sudan. And with those deals and negotiations, they're saying, okay, we'll give you the oil through the pipelines because we have more control. So the rapid support forces have control over the oil that is going into South Sudan rather than the Sudanese armed forces. And those deals and negotiations that they make with these countries especially with gold as well. The illicit gold mining that is coming out of Darfur. And that's still under investigation, so I can't say this is exactly why this is happening. But there is speculation that the illicit gold trade is still ongoing, especially controlled by the Rapid Support Forces. So these are the deals that they're making with other outside countries who want to continue their deals with the rapid, let's say with the Rapid Support Forces. Um, and with that, they will continue to provide them whatever they need in order for them to be more superior than the other side of the military factor. Then you have the Sudanese Armed Forces who are making deals with Iran, with Turkey, with Russia, allowing them to, Russia or China or Iran to have access through the port, which is a huge, you know, focal point of them being able to receive a lot of minerals and a lot of the essentials that they need and that they are able to exchange weapons for as well. So the deals and negotiations that both sides of these military factors have made keeps them at a constant, battle with one another. And nobody wants to lose their support or to lose these skills that they have with both sides of these military factors. So, that's kind of where I see the reason why it's continuously being led to even more chaos. Why now we're seeing more drones. But like I said, it's still under investigation, but that is kind of where it's really basically coming from.
So I think a lot of the energy, it seems, in terms of any of the reporting that's coming out is really focusing on the RSF and the SAF and like kind of internal Sudanese actors, as if this is like this thing that is just the Sudanese have to figure it out. It's a civil war. Like this is like, we're not supposed to get involved. But the reality is this feels so much more like a classic proxy situation where all these other forces internationally are really engaged here. And I don't think people fully understand the way these tentacles like stretch out of Sudan, who those actors are, and what type of an influence they have on the situation on the ground.
Right, yes. And that's what makes this war so complicated is the different allies, the different countries that are supporting this war that continue to prolong this war and really escalate this war to new measures. So for the Sudanese armed forces, you have Egypt, and Egypt is supporting the Sudanese armed forces because they really want to kind of have more regional control, especially along the border. And then you have Iran, who's supporting the Sudanese armed forces as well, and Turkey, Russia, and they're supplying them with military weapons, and that's the thing that has been really kind of prolonging is this providing and then also giving them access to, let's say, the port of Sudan. Iran really wants the access to the port of Sudan, which the Sudanese armed forces have control over at right now. So therefore, they're trying to create more alliance with them and providing them with whatever they need, basically. And then you have the rapid support forces who are being supported by the UAE and also Eastern Libya and Ethiopia as well, and we're well, not Ethiopia, but Uganda and South Sudan. Um, and we're seeing kind of this shift with China. China is also supporting both sides. They're just kind of wanting more control over the infrastructure, the port of Sudan, especially, um, and they're just kind of giving both weaponaries from drones to whatever is needed to both sides of both RSF and SOF. But that's what makes it very hard to dismantle is because of all these proxies that are coming together, and they're also supporting both sides of these fighters. And what is also making it very unstable is like the fact that the AU is also very corrupt. So the chances of the African Union peacekeeping forces coming back in is not very likely at all. So it's very hard to determine what's going to happen next, because they're continuing to get such support from outsiders, from these countries and these companies that are also supporting both the RSF and SOF. So it's kind of hard to see like where the intervention should lead to, but this is kind of where they're gaining a lot of their strengths, is through outside resources at the moment. Um,
But this, it feels like from an economic standpoint, Sudan has constantly been stuck in this what's the phrase, like the Dutch disease economics, like for a country that like suffers from over
mm,
reliance on one particular one crop or one resource. I think it's terrible that they call it the Dutch disease, but everyone likes this alliteration. But it's not fair that the Dutch get it, because it should be Spanish sickness or the British blight, or maybe now it should be this Sudanese syndrome or something, because this is fucking insane what's happening there. But like historically,
mhm.
it was cotton. Then
Right,
the cotton industry, which completely fed everything into Egypt, was super lucrative. But then they discovered oil, and then everything shifted to
right,
oil. And then when the split happened in 11, all suddenly the oil was out, and then it had to go to gold. So now you have the
right,
gold, but the gold is no longer for the country. It's, as you're saying, it's for whoever has control, the illicit mining. Hemeti has like total control of a gold network well before
hmm,
any of this really takes place. Bashir's still in power, and he's already got influence in this way.
right,
But the idea of the concept of these Dutch disease is that like they don't do anything with that money, and then
hmm,
eventually that currency collapses as a result of it, right? But
right,
like Norway was the example of success, where they created a sovereign wealth fund, and that this helped solve the problem of their oil reserves that they found in the north, right? But technically, the sovereign wealth fund for Sudan went to individual people. It didn't go to the country. So then it
right.
really just destroyed the economy of the country. So I don't know how you wrestle that back.
I don't see how where it could lead other than allowing these two armed factors to agree on, this is the area that I have control over, and this is the area that you have control over. And we're going to split it down the middle, and maybe it becoming two different countries,
So in that
like we
scenario,
saw in
yeah,
South Sudan.
in that
Yeah,
scenario, like Kordofan, where does that factor in? Like this seems to be the big prize. Like the all of the
yeah,
violence and all the chaos in Al Fashir, that's all well deep in the lines of RSF. But Kordofan is
right,
super critical because it is pretty much the gateway to the south.
right.
So whoever has that seemingly has the advantage.
In the Blue Nile.
Yeah, but in Kordofan in particular, um, if this country was to somehow, if we were to somehow, international forces finally get involved and start, finally say, well, maybe now we want to do more than just raise an alarm bell and say, we need to actually do something. And if they were to create some sort of like kind of Dayton agreement style, like, and that ended the Bosnian War, and it left
Mhm.
Sudan together as a country, but that these two regions had some sense of autonomy, um, would that work? And then who would have Kordofan, in terms of how critical that would be in the middle? Or are we looking at a hardcore separation? It wouldn't be by referendum like it was for South Sudan, where 99% of the people said, yes, we want independence. But would this be a hard cut East and West Sudan now?
I would say yes, because the two would never be able to or be in the same facility to say, okay, let's share these resources, but somehow make an agreement together. I only see it to be a complete split for both of them to take certain portions of Sudan, just because of the history, just because of their background ethically. Like the Sudanese armed forces are more Arab Muslim based, and the Muslim Brotherhood really ties into what they want specifically Sudan to be, which
Mm.
is what the Rapid Support Forces don't want. So because of that, there could never be they would never be able to agree upon sharing specific land. So the only way I could see it is, like you said, being a complete split between the two. Um, but like you just said, Kordofan, the Blue Nile, these are major resources that enrich Sudan. It brings in agriculture. It's a huge you know investment in the oil. So it that area alone is where they're really fighting the most. Um, so it's really hard to say who would have control over that if there were to be a split, because they would not be able to agree upon anything, as we've seen time and time
So,
again.
so you don't think that there would? I'm just being like a crazy weird optimist here, like that region or these regions that are so critical for both couldn't possibly be shared and be some sort of like I don't know, like a like an economic DMZ, like where the region is allowed to function for what its
So
value is, and then it's equally split between the two, or there's just not that like it's literally zero sum game here.
it's really hard to say because I want to be optimistic and I want to say, yes, there is a chance that they could somehow split it amongst each other through some sort of peace deal that they can negotiate together and agree upon. But I don't I don't see it heading in that direction just because of where we're at right now with the war and how much atrocities have already been made. Um, Unfortunately, no.
So, considering that we've already essentially unpacked a lot of the external actors that are influencing the reality on the ground inside Sudan, and there's ample evidence of the war crimes that are being committed by the RSF as well as the SAF, and that many of the people who have committed these crimes are really able to do so with impunity. I guess the question that everyone always then asks at the end of learning something terrible like this is like, what are we supposed to do about it? And who is supposed to act to bring stability and end to this conflict, and then save more lives before this continues to escalate? So, who needs to act? What do they need to do? And then how do we collectively push towards that result?
Um, yeah, good question. Well, currently the U.S. policy has called for sanctions and a 3-month humanitarian truce. But these kind of temporary ceasefires and peace deals only last for so long. There's so much like peace talks and negotiations around humanitarian aid and a humanitarian emergency. And rather than looking at it as such a humanitarian emergency, which it is, it's one of the biggest humanitarian crises today. But instead of just coming at it and just in that angle alone, it should be looked at also a political crisis that demands consequences. The U.S. should really look into who is giving money, access, kind of fueling these political parties to continue to fight and to kind of sustain this conflict that we're seeing right now. So, kind of making sure that they're making diplomatic agreements with the governments that are supporting Sudan's warring parties, putting an end to the trading and putting an end to the money, the fuel, the political protection that continues to reach both sides of these fighting parties. And once we section off that and sanction, and to make political agreements with those who are providing, protecting, and kind of creating this continuous fuel, adding to this war, then that's when we can really see the war decreasing. But the U.S. is not doing that for various reasons. That means they have to make agreements and deals and consequences if it continues with UAE, for instance. And that, that is very complicated for the U.S. to start, to get into, also with the UAE. And I think it becomes more of a different take on how they're going to create some sort of political agreement with these outsiders, with different countries that are getting involved, rather than just focusing on sanctions and creating some sort of temporary ceasefire or humanitarian truce. The thing with that, time and time again, we just continue to see these ceasefires or peace deals that we try to get involved in or try to establish, they always fall through. They're never actually going to be concrete and stabilize the country. So it will take a lot more involvement. But until then, it's just the war will continue to escalate. And I think right now we're seeing that there is, definitely going to be a split, possibly, between these two fighting parties. They'll probably have control over different areas of Sudan, and it will continue to exacerbate, and it will continue to fuel a lot of, internal and tribal wars as well. So until until something is done externally, it's just gonna continue to to get worse. Yeah, it's a disaster. It's a huge disaster what we're seeing right now.
Yeah. So with the time we have left, I think it would be important for us to at least touch upon a little bit of the refugee situation, because this type of conflict is obviously going to send people. It's going to displace people. It's going to send them running for safety in other countries. And we already lightly touched upon it before, but 90%, almost something crazy, like 90% of the people who are refugees have become refugees in other countries regionally. And this lines up with the UNHCR's data report, the global report from 2024. The new one isn't out yet, but that report said that 70% of all refugees in the world, 70% stay within one border. So this kind of fascist, riled up, crazy anti-immigrant energy in Europe specifically is not factual. And the numbers from 2025 show that the Sudanese who actually even made it to Europe represent 0.4% of all the refugees coming for asylum, all the people seeking asylum. So it is a non-number in the larger mess. And you have major countries in the region hosting millions of people and hundreds of thousands of people. But there seems to be a bit of a lopsided level of what someone can get refugee status depending upon where they go. So if they go south to South Sudan, which is kind of insane, like we said earlier, but if they go further to Uganda, or if they go to Kenya, or if they go to Chad, or if they go, good Lord, you're going to Libya for refugee protection? What the hell, right? Or are you going to Egypt, where the majority of them are going, but only, it's crazy that in the African countries, only something crazy, 50% of them get protections. Yet if they do make it to Europe, 99% would get protections, simply because of what's going on. And yet, depending on which country you go to in Europe, you may not even get a chance to claim your asylum because you'll automatically be detained. As we're seeing this past year on Gavdos, the island south of Crete in Greece, where Sudanese that would get protection simply because they're Sudanese are being detained for illegal arrivals. So, I don't know, maybe I'm just going off on a little bit of a rant here, but the point I'm making is that it doesn't feel fair what's happening to the people inside the region, that they aren't automatically being given protections that are official, internationally recognized protections. And it may be because of who does or doesn't sign on to that convention from 1951. But then those who finally make their way through, good Lord, the things they have to go through to get through Libya, to get to a boat, to survive the boat, to get to Europe, they're not even getting the same level of protections that someone would walk across the border from Ukraine,
Right.
even though both countries are creating the largest movements of people out of the country borders. I don't know if in the work you're doing with the hub, with the Human Rights Hub, if there's any engagement with the refugee situation, any extra information that you could give us about like what's going on in Chad or what's happening in other countries in the region, and how Sudanese are moving.
Um, oof, that's a heavy one because we don't really focus too much on the refugee crisis that's happening in neighboring countries. We do know like the estimate of how many refugees are going into Chad, or keeping an eye on the refugee flow, especially when there's attacks along the border in, let's say, El Fasher or in Nyala, and seeing just the increase of refugees that are escaping. Um, it's really hard to say, but we, in South Sudan when I was there, that was like the last place that Sudanese wanted to go, because also the rapid support forces um, can go in and out of South Sudan. And they have some sort of refuge there as well. So if you go into South Sudan, a lot of them are being attacked by the rapid support forces. Um, and then further in, there's also tribal wars that that they have to be aware of as well. Like, they're usually caught up in the mix of the war in Sudan, and also the wars, the tribal wars that are happening in South Sudan. If they pass South Sudan, and if they're lucky, it usually takes like a year for them to be able to get some sort of status. Then they can travel to Uganda, but you have to have money in order to travel to Uganda or Kenya or Rwanda. So if you don't have money, then you're stuck in these neighboring countries, and a lot of them die because of the diseases and of the attacks that are continuously happening within the camps. So it's a really sad situation because there's, 14 million refugees that are displaced both internally and externally. So you're talking about millions and probably millions more that are going to be coming in through these borders, and there's no structure, there's no infrastructure for them to, find safety and security. There's no aid, there's no protection, there's no food. So, and then you have like I said, the rapid support forces coming into South Sudan as well. So there's really no escape. Um, it's unless they're able to save money and get themselves into a third country, then they're in a very dire situation. Continuously will be in a very dire situation. So yeah, it's a very tough subject because, like you said, Europe is not really accepting them. Um, Even though they signed into the Refugee Convention in 1951, seems like a lot of countries are pulling back as if they didn't really sign it. So that's really frustrating. It's frustrating to see the escalation and new numbers of refugees, and seeing what they're having to live through, and knowing that it could be better if they were just given a chance for asylum or refugee status in one of these European countries that they could easily get asked, to easily travel to. Um, so yeah, it's tough, especially on this day when it's something to really reflect on. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, but I guess, maybe I don't think we can count on America to be a support in this, because they've already, used all of their available spaces and resources for these white South Africans that really
right.
need to be protected from a genocide. They just added 10,000 more spots for them, but nobody else. Um,
Yeah,
but here you have this happening in front of us, and a fictitious genocide is giving precedent to what will shape up in the history books as an actual one. Um,
right.
uh, but just to clarify a quick point that you made, did you say that if you needed to get, like, it would take a year to get some status in South Sudan if you left Sudan, and I think that then from there you would need that status first before you could go further south, like, so it requires multiple layers of protection status before you can move on to the next place?
Before you can move on to the next place, yeah, I was following one refugee who was waiting for their refugee status, and they're in these camps that where, there's, 500,000 people that are trying to wait for their own refugee status. So they're in order for them to receive one, they have to basically wait their turn, which is takes up to a year. Some people are very lucky and they have either some sort of process that they've already started doing and they are able to get a status quicker than others, but it can take up to a year if you're starting the process in order to get a refugee status or some sort of status that allows you to move to a third country.
I mean, and in Europe, we
Yeah.
have the reverse, which is you get to the first country, that's it. The Dublin rules say you cannot go any further. So if you've been processed by a southern country, you're not allowed to move forward to another space,
Right.
unless you're Ukrainian. Then you could like
Yeah.
kind of go wherever you want for your 3 year protection. But if you
Mhm.
were to go further north to another country, say Germany or the Netherlands or Belgium or France or something, you'd eventually at some point those governments may push you back to the country of your arrival simply because that's where you
Mhm.
started the process and that's where you're supposed to stay. And you're saying it's the reverse here in Africa where you'd have to go through the process repeatedly, uh, like just to get like a longer term protection.
Right.
That's
And
kind of
also
crazy.
during that time, especially like in South Sudan, you're not allowed to work. It's very hard for them to get like some sort of work visa or being able to provide themselves some sort of income to travel to the next country. So a lot of them are just stuck in these refugee camps with no way out. So it's quite sad.
And no legal and economic pathways to just survive and do what you need to do yourself.
Right.
Like,
The corruption is so bad there. And when I was there, in order to get permission to work in or to film or work in the refugee camp, I had to go through like have an interview with this military general who asked me what kind of reporting do I normally do. So it was kind of already this like corruption scandal that you could see. Um, where are they using their resources to provide more, humanitarian aid agencies or to give them the kind of process that they need inside these camps? Where is that money going to? Where is the money going to like help restructure these camps? So the camps that they're also going to are completely destroyed by years of being unkept, diseases, people coming in and creating gangs or militias, and then the RSFs can come in and create attacks because there's a lack of security. It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible.
so I'm sure you told him that you were there because you're a fashion reporter and you're all about travel and leisure, right? Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
doing a show for Vogue. No, I said that I was there to do a documentary about a refugee that was from Sudan that was in the refugee camp. I try to be as honest as possible to know that, like, if I were to get caught or they were to look at my footage, that I was telling some sort of truth to it. But you also have to act kind of naive and be like, what corruption? I don't know what you're talking about.
what is that word? I have no idea what that means. Please tell me.
Yeah.
Like,
Is corruption spelled with a K or a C? But yeah, it was very sad to see the way that a lot of the Sudanese that were escaping into South Sudan were being left in. Um, I know, like, some of the Sudanese I spoke to were considering going back to Sudan because of how bad the situation was in South Sudan. Like, can you imagine wanting to go back to a country where it's like a massive civil war where you're probably 50, like, there's a 50-50 chance of you surviving if you go back, but because of the places that you're staying in is so inhabitable and just you can't live there anymore, that your next choice is to go back to Sudan. Like, that broke my heart.
this
But
was
yeah, that's a
this was like the your protagonist in Invisible War, right? He had to
yeah,
consider this.
right. But
it's
there's
insane.
been Sudanese that have considered this as it's that he was not the only one. So yeah, it's horrible.
Jordan, thank you so much for joining us
Well,
again,
thank
and
you.
please maybe connect with us on a different topic. We would love to have you back to talk
Yes.
about something that maybe it is about fashion or food. Who knows? Some travel and leisure.
I love food, so I can talk about food all day.
All right, great.
Or fashion.
Cool. Thank you so much,
All
Jordan.
right,
It's a
thank you
pleasure to
so
always talk
much.
with you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Everybody, thank you so much for joining this special episode of Fractured. And on this specific week or month or day or whatever we want to call it, Human Rights Week, we really do care deeply about ensuring that the people who are on the move and are in desperate need of support receive it, and that our governments are honoring international laws. And we need to stand together to make sure that that happens. So please support organizations like Refocus Media Labs, which produces this podcast, and Sudan Human Rights Hub, which Jordan works with. It's a critical necessity to make sure that people are showing solidarity. So thank you very much, and we will talk very soon in our next episode.